April 15th, 1945. The small Bavarian town of Mitterteich lay shrouded in morning mist, its cobblestone streets eerily silent except for the distant rumble of American artillery. Lieutenant James Harlow of the 101st Airborne Division stood at the edge of town. Binoculars trained on the abandoned schoolhouse that intelligence suggested housed a German communications post. The exhausted officer believed this would be a routine clearance operation before pushing eastward toward Czechoslovakia. He could not have imagined that within 24 hours, his actions in this unremarkable town would lead to one of the most unexpected humanitarian exchanges of the entire European campaign. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a single act of compassion during the final, desperate days of the conflict transformed not only the lives of two remarkable German sisters, but also changed the heart of a hardened German general, leading to a decision that would save thousands of lives on both sides of the rapidly collapsing front. In the spring of 1945, the strategic situation for German forces had deteriorated beyond recovery. The massive Allied bombing campaign had reduced German industrial production to 43% of its 1944 peak. Fuel shortages had immobilized much of the remaining German armor, with official records showing that 78% of tanks and armored vehicles were inoperable due to lack of fuel rather than mechanical failure. The American advance eastward had accelerated dramatically, with forward units of General Patton's Third Army advancing as much as 35 miles in a single day, capturing over 10,000 German troops, many of whom surrendered without firing a shot. Among those facing this overwhelming American juggernaut was General Major Ernst Hoffmann of the German 19th Army. A career military officer who had served since the Great War, Hoffmann commanded a hodgepodge defensive force consisting primarily of Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth, interspersed with a few battle-hardened veterans. His official strength report listed 18,000 men under his command, but internal communications revealed that only about 6,000 were actually present, with adequate ammunition for perhaps 3 days of sustained fighting. Hoffmann maintained his headquarters in the grand estate of Schloss Falkenberg, 15 miles east of Mitterteich. A proud Prussian from a long military tradition, he had privately lost faith in final victory months earlier, but remained determined to fulfill his duty. His aide, Hauptmann Werner Krauss, noted in his personal diary, "The general speaks no more of victory, only of honor. He studies the maps each morning with the grim concentration of a chess player who knows he is beaten but searches for a way to avoid immediate checkmate." While strategic concerns occupied the military leadership, for civilians in the path of the American advance, more immediate fears dominated their thoughts. Among these civilians were the Müller sisters, Frieda and Gerda, who lived on a small farm on the outskirts of Mitterteich. What made the sisters remarkable was their extraordinary height. Frieda stood 6 feet 7 inches tall, while her younger sister Gerda measured 6 feet 5 inches. Their unusual stature had made them objects of fascination throughout their lives. In 1936, both had been approached by representatives of a eugenics program that sought to study them as examples of superior Germanic stock, but their father, a Lutheran minister, had firmly refused. Since his passing in 1942, the sisters had maintained the family farm alone, their mother having died years earlier. Their height and strength had proven advantageous in managing agricultural work without male assistance, allowing them to support themselves when many other women struggled. Lieutenant James Harlow, the American officer who would soon cross paths with the Müller sisters, came from Wilmington, Delaware. Before the war, he had worked as a high school history teacher with a particular interest in European history. Drafted in 1942, his education and aptitude tests had routed him to officer candidate school, where he earned his commission before joining the 101st Airborne. Though he had not participated in the airborne operations in Normandy or Market Garden, he had seen heavy fighting since joining as a replacement officer during the Battle of the Bulge. Captain Thomas Reynolds, Harlow's company commander, described him in an official commendation as possessing a rare combination of intellectual curiosity and practical leadership. His men follow him not because he raises his voice, but because he demonstrates thoughtfulness in his decisions. This character assessment would prove significant in the events that followed. As dawn broke on April 15th, Lieutenant Harlow led his platoon of 30 men into Mitterteich. Intelligence reports had indicated minimal resistance, as most German forces had withdrawn eastward to more defensible positions. The Americans advanced cautiously through the town, encountering only a few elderly civilians who watched from behind partially drawn curtains. Staff Sergeant William O'Malley, Harlow's platoon sergeant, recalled the morning. The town felt like a ghost story. You could sense people watching, but nobody showed themselves. The lieutenant ordered us to maintain strict fire discipline, no shooting unless fired upon first. He kept saying this wasn't about taking scalps. It was about ending this thing with as little bloodshed as possible. Around 9:30 in the morning, the platoon approached the town's small railway station, which aerial reconnaissance had identified as a potential German observation post. As they secured the perimeter, a tremendous crash echoed from a warehouse across the street, followed by feminine screams and what sounded like a prolonged struggle. Private First Class Michael Donovan, the platoon's medic, later wrote to his parents, "We all froze, weapons ready, but the lieutenant held up his hand for us to wait." The sounds weren't German soldiers, they were women's voices, and they sounded terrified. Harlow selected 5 men to investigate, while the remainder of the platoon secured their position. As they approached the warehouse, the screaming intensified, punctuated by the sound of splintering wood. Harlow ordered 2 men to cover the rear exit, while he and the remaining 3 entered through the front. What they discovered inside the warehouse defied their expectations entirely. 2 extraordinarily tall women, the Müller sisters, were trapped beneath a collapsed storage rack. Heavy wooden beams had fallen across their lower bodies, and though their tremendous strength had prevented them from being crushed completely, they were pinned down and unable to free themselves. Their faces registered first terror, then confusion at the sight of American uniforms. Frieda Müller, the elder sister, spoke first in accented but clear English. "Please, we are civilians. We came for flour from the storage. The shelf broke. We cannot move." The Americans hesitated briefly, but Harlow immediately ordered his men to help. "Donovan, check them for injuries. O'Malley, help me get this beam up. Rodriguez, find something we can use as a lever." For 20 minutes, the American soldiers worked alongside the German women to free them from the debris. Once liberated, it became apparent that Gerda had suffered a serious gash to her leg that was bleeding profusely. Donovan applied a field dressing and administered sulfur powder to prevent infection, while Harlow communicated with the sisters. He learned that they had come to the warehouse seeking food supplies after their farm had been damaged by artillery fire the previous night. With German authorities having abandoned the town and most civilians hiding in their homes, they had taken the risk of venturing out for provisions. What happened next would later be described in Harlow's official report with understated simplicity. Made the decision to escort civilian casualties to their residence and ensure proper medical treatment, as no military objectives were compromised by this humanitarian action. In reality, Harlow ordered a jeep brought forward and personally accompanied Donovan in transporting the sisters back to their farm on the outskirts of town. The sight of the enormous women being helped by American soldiers created an unusual spectacle that did not go unnoticed by the few townspeople watching from their windows. Upon arriving at the Müller farm, Harlow and Donovan discovered substantial damage to the main house from what appeared to be an errant artillery shell. The barn, however, remained intact, and the sisters indicated they could shelter there temporarily. Donovan provided additional medical supplies and basic instructions for changing Gerda's bandage, while Harlow arranged for rations to be delivered from the company's supplies. Before departing, Frieda Müller took Lieutenant Harlow's hand in hers, her massive palm engulfing his entirely, and spoke words that would later prove prophetic. "My father always said that God's light shines through the cracks of our broken world. Today, I see that light in you, American. Not all enemies must remain enemies forever." Harlow rejoined his platoon within the hour, and the Americans continued their methodical clearing of the town, eventually establishing a command post in the town hall by mid-afternoon. That evening, as the company officers gathered for a briefing, few paid special attention to the lieutenant's brief mention of assisting injured civilians. Such humanitarian gestures, while not uncommon among Allied forces, rarely merited official notice in the daily reports transmitted up the chain of command. Unknown to the Americans, however, this seemingly minor incident was about to take an unexpected turn. Approximately 7 miles from Mitterteich, a German reconnaissance patrol led by Oberleutnant Kurt Weber had observed the Americans entering the town. Among Weber's patrol was a young soldier named Heinrich Schmidt, a native of Mitterteich, who recognized the Müller sisters being transported in the American jeep. When the patrol returned to the German lines that evening, Schmidt mentioned this observation to his commanding officer. Under normal circumstances, such information might have been dismissed as irrelevant to military operations. However, by coincidence, General Major Hoffmann had a personal connection to the Müller family. 27 years earlier, during the Great War, a young Lieutenant Hoffmann had been saved from death by the sisters' father, Pastor Wilhelm Müller, who had found the wounded officer in no man's land and dragged him to safety despite the danger to himself. When Hoffmann received the patrol report mentioning the Müller sisters, he immediately requested more information. Oberleutnant Weber was summoned to headquarters at Schloss Falkenberg, where he provided a detailed account of what his patrol had observed. Hoffmann's aide, Hauptmann Kraus, wrote in his diary that evening, "A strange transformation came over the general upon hearing of the American treatment of these civilian women. He became very still, staring into the distance as if seeing something beyond the walls of the room. Then he called for maps and began making calculations with an intensity I have not witnessed in months. Throughout the night, Hoffmann remained in his office, consulting personnel records and drafting orders. By dawn on April 16th, he had reached a decision so unexpected that when he first announced it to his staff, several officers asked him to repeat himself, certain they had misheard. General Major Hoffmann had decided to negotiate a limited local surrender of his forces to the Americans. At approximately 7:15 on the morning of April 16th, American radio operators intercepted an unusual transmission in clear English rather than in coded German. American forces in Mitterteich. German command requests parley under white flag at noon today. Humanitarian matter. Coordinates follow. The message was passed up to regimental headquarters, where Colonel Franklin Pierce initially suspected a trap. However, aerial reconnaissance confirmed unusual activity at the specified location, a crossroads 2 miles east of Mitterteich, including the positioning of a large white banner visible from the air. After consultation with division headquarters, Colonel Pierce authorized Captain Reynolds to meet the German delegation, accompanied by Lieutenant Harlow, who spoke some German, and a full security detail. The Americans were instructed to approach with extreme caution and be prepared for possible deception. At precisely 1200 hours, 3 German vehicles approached the crossroads from the east. The lead vehicle displayed prominent white flags, and the Americans observed through binoculars that the German officers were unarmed. Following standard protocol, the American security detail took covered positions, while Captain Reynolds and Lieutenant Harlow advanced to meet the Germans. From the lead German vehicle emerged General Major Hoffmann himself, accompanied by Hauptmann Kraus and a German medical officer, Stabsarzt Wilhelm Bauer. Hoffmann, tall and distinguished with iron-grey hair beneath his cap, approached the Americans with formal military bearing. Speaking in accented but fluent English, Hoffmann introduced himself and came directly to the point. "Gentlemen, I have come to discuss terms for the surrender of certain units under my command, comprising approximately 6,000 men, along with all equipment and supplies." Captain Reynolds, taken aback by this unexpectedly straightforward proposal, requested clarification. "General, are we to understand you're proposing a partial surrender of your forces?" "That is correct, Captain," Hoffmann replied. "I am authorized to negotiate the surrender of all German forces between the Naab and Wandreb rivers, which constitute approximately 1/3 of my command." Reynolds, following his orders, responded that he would need to refer such a proposal to higher headquarters, as he lacked authority to accept a surrender of that magnitude. It was at this point that Hoffmann turned to Lieutenant Harlow and said something that transformed the meeting. "You are the officer who assisted the Müller sisters yesterday, are you not?" Surprised at being addressed directly, Harlow confirmed that he was. Hoffman's next words were recorded in Captain Reynolds's subsequent report. The general stated, "What you and your men did yesterday demonstrates that humanity can prevail even in these dark times. I once owed my life to the father of those women. It seems the debt has now transferred to their American protectors." The German general continued, explaining that the strategic situation was hopeless, and he wished to spare both his men and American forces the needless bloodshed that would result from continued resistance in his sector. However, he could not surrender his entire command without explicit orders from his superiors, which would not be forthcoming. This partial surrender represented the maximum he could justify under his understanding of his oath. Captain Reynolds requested a brief recess to communicate with his headquarters, which Hoffman graciously granted. During the 30 minutes that followed, frantic radio communications took place between the crossroads, regimental headquarters, and division command post. Colonel Pierce initially expressed skepticism, but the division commander, Brigadier General Walter Simmons, quickly recognized the potential value of the offer. 6,000 prisoners and their equipment would be secured without fighting, potentially saving hundreds of lives on both sides. He authorized Reynolds to proceed with preliminary arrangements while sending staff officers forward to finalize details. When discussions resumed, Hoffman presented a simple set of conditions. His surrendering troops would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, wounded German soldiers would receive medical attention, and civilians in the affected area would be protected from reprisals. These terms were entirely acceptable to the Americans, who had standing orders to this effect anyway. By 14:30 hours, the preliminary surrender agreement had been drafted. Hoffman then made one final personal request that was not included in the official document. He asked that special consideration be shown to the Müller sisters, ensuring they retained their farm property once occupation authorities established control. Lieutenant Harlow, with Captain Reynolds' permission, assured the general that they would personally see to the sisters' welfare in the immediate term and would recommend protected status for their property to civil affairs officers. With formal handshakes, the meeting concluded. Hoffman would return to his headquarters to issue the necessary orders, while the Americans prepared to receive the surrendering German forces beginning at dawn the next day. What followed was one of the most orderly mass surrenders of the European campaign. Beginning at 0600 hours on April 17th, German units began arriving at designated collection points in groups of approximately 100 men. Each group was led by its officers, who formally surrendered their sidearms to American officers before their men stacked rifles and machine guns in orderly piles. By midday, American logistical capabilities were strained by the unexpected influx of prisoners. Captain Ronald Miller, the regimental S4 logistics officer, recorded in the unit journal, "Processing over 5,000 prisoners in a single morning has depleted available rations and transportation. Have requested additional support from division. German prisoners are orderly and compliant, many expressing relief that their war is over." Hauptmann Kraus, who surrendered with Hoffman's headquarters staff, later wrote in Allied captivity, "It was as if a great weight had been lifted from all of us. The men marched into captivity with heads held high, knowing they had fulfilled their duty honorably, but were no longer required to die for a cause that was already lost." True to Hoffman's prediction, the surrender created a significant gap in the German defensive line. American forces exploited this opening over the following 3 days, advancing rapidly eastward with minimal resistance. By April 20th, they had penetrated more than 30 miles beyond their positions on the 16th, capturing an additional 8,000 German troops, who found themselves outflanked and surrounded. German military historians would later estimate that Hoffman's decision shortened the regional campaign by approximately 2 weeks and saved between 3,000 and 5,000 lives on both sides combined. On the morning of April 18, Lieutenant Harlow received permission to check on the Miller sisters, bringing with him additional medical supplies and food rations. He found them busy repairing damage to their farm, Gerda's leg healing well thanks to Donovan's medical attention. During this visit, Frieda Müller shared a surprising piece of information. "Your general should know that when we were children, General Major Hoffman would visit our father every year on Remembrance Day. He called father his guardian angel. Now he has become one himself. Has he not? The story of the Mueller sisters and General Major Hoffman's surrender remained largely unknown in the immediate aftermath of the war. The sisters continued to work their farm through the difficult post-war years, occasionally receiving visits from former Lieutenant Harlow, who returned to Germany as a historical researcher in 1953. During one such visit, Harlow recorded an oral history interview with the sisters, who by then had become minor celebrities in the reconstructed West Germany for their agricultural innovations. Frieda Müller told him, "People see our height and think that is what makes us special. But the true measure of any person is not found in their physical stature, but in the height of their compassion when faced with those labeled as enemies." General Major Hoffman spent 3 years in an American prisoner of war camp before being repatriated to Germany in 1948. Unlike many former German officers who wrote self-serving memoirs, Hoffman maintained a dignified silence about his wartime service. When approached by journalists or historians, he would only say, "I did what any officer should do, protected my men from unnecessary sacrifice when victory was no longer possible." In 1962, American television producer Edward R. Murrow learned of the story while researching unusual incidents of the European campaign. His production team tracked down Hoffman, by then 73 years old and living modestly in Hamburg, and convinced him to appear in a documentary alongside James Harlow and the Müller sisters. During filming, Hoffman made a statement that perhaps best encapsulates the moral of this remarkable episode. War teaches us to see enemies everywhere. Peace begins when we recognize the humanity in those we have been told to hate. Sometimes it takes extraordinary circumstances or extraordinary people to remind us of this simple truth. The documentary, titled Compassion Under Fire, won several awards and brought wider attention to the story of how a simple act of kindness toward 2 unusually tall German sisters led to one of the most consequential local surrenders of the conflict's final days. Military historians have since analyzed Hoffman's decision extensively. Colonel Richard Winters of the 101st Airborne, retired, commented in 1983, "Hoffman's surrender represents a fascinating case study in military ethics. He found a way to balance his oath as an officer with his moral obligation to prevent needless loss of life. The catalyst, learning of the American treatment of civilians with whom he had a personal connection, provided the justification he needed to take an action he likely already knew was correct." In the summer of 1965, a small monument was erected at the crossroads where Hoffman and Reynolds had met 20 years earlier. The inscription, written in both German and English, reads simply, "At this place, humanity prevailed over hatred. April 16, 1945. The Müller sisters continued to work their farm until 1978, when they sold the property and retired to a small cottage in the Bavarian countryside. Both lived to remarkable ages, Frieda passing away in 1993 at the age of 88, and Gerda in 2001 at the age of 94. James Harlow eventually published a book titled Small Mercies, Great Consequences, Personal Acts of Compassion in World War II. In the chapter devoted to the Müller sisters, he wrote, "Throughout history, we tend to focus on the grand strategies, the massive battles, the sweeping political decisions that shape conflicts. But sometimes it is the smallest actions, helping 2 civilian women trapped under fallen debris, that trigger the most profound consequences. This reminds us that even in war, individual moral choices matter, perhaps more than we can ever realize in the moment." The story of the Müller sisters reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual acts of compassion can create ripples that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. General Major Hoffman's decision, motivated by gratitude for the humane treatment of 2 civilians, likely saved thousands of lives and helped bring a swifter end to hostilities in that sector of the front. Perhaps most remarkably, this chain of events began with Lieutenant Harlow's split-second decision to help 2 trapped civilians, rather than simply continuing his military mission. His choice, made in an instant without consideration of potential consequences, demonstrates how adherence to fundamental human values, even amid conflict, can sometimes achieve more than strict military calculation. In the post-war testimonies of the various participants, one consistent theme emerges. None considered their actions particularly heroic or extraordinary. Harlow insisted he merely did what any decent person would do when finding injured civilians. Hoffman maintained he simply made a rational decision based on the strategic realities and his obligation to his men. The Müller sisters believed they had done nothing special in accepting help from those they had been told were enemies. Yet collectively, their ordinary decency in extraordinary circumstances created a remarkable outcome that saved thousands of lives. Their story stands as a testament to how individual moral choices, even in the chaos of war, can sometimes alter the course of events in ways no strategic plan could anticipate. The military historian John Keegan once observed, "The history of warfare is usually written in terms of grand strategy, tactics, technology, and leadership. But wars are fought by individual human beings whose personal decisions, especially in critical moments, can sometimes influence events far beyond their apparent significance at the time." The case of Lieutenant Harlow, the Müller sisters, and General Major Hoffman perfectly illustrates this principle. A chance encounter, a humanitarian gesture, and a connection to the past combined to create circumstances that allowed humanity to temporarily transcend the bitter divisions of a world at war. In today's world, where conflicts continue to divide humanity, perhaps the most valuable lesson from this obscure historical episode is that compassion across enemy lines is not merely idealistic sentimentality, but can sometimes achieve concrete results that benefit all sides. The decision to see the humanity in those designated as enemies might be, as Hoffman demonstrated, not only morally right, but strategically wise. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.